Page 371, Chapter 10, The Law Matures. But where were those mobs, insanely storming barbed wire barricades of our western borders, whom we were going to shoot? Under Article 71 of the Criminal Code, for authorized, unauthorized return to the Russian Soviet Federated Socialist Republic, contrary to scientific prediction, there were no such crowds, and that article of the code dictated by Lenin to Kursky remained useless. The only Russian crazy enough to do it was Savinkov, and they had ducked applying that article even to him. On the other hand, the opposite party, exile abroad instead of execution, was tried out immediately on a large scale. In those days when he was composing the criminal code, Vladimir Lenin, developing his brilliant idea, wrote in the heat of the moment on May 19th, quote, Comrade Dzerzhinsky, on the question of exiling abroad writers and professors who aid the counter-revolution, this is a measure which must be prepared most carefully. Unless we prepare well, we can commit stupidities. We must arrange the business in such a way as to catch these military spies, and keep on catching them constantly and systematically, and exiling them abroad. I beg you to show this secretly, and without making any copies of it, to members of the Politburo. The extreme secrecy, unquote, the extreme secrecy was natural in view of the importance and instructive impact of the measure. The crystal clear lineup of forces on the classic front of Soviet Russia was, to put it simply, spoiled by the presence of this shapeless jelly-like stain of the old bourgeois intelligentsia, which in the ideological area genuinely played the role of military spies. And the very best solution one could imagine was to scrape off that stagnant scum of ideas and toss it out abroad. Comrade Lenin had always been stricken by his illness, but the members of the Politburo had apparently given their approval, and Comrade Dzerzhinsky had done the catching. At the end of 1922, about 300 prominent Russian humanists were loaded onto a barge, perhaps. No, they were put on a steamer and sent off to the European garbage dump. Among those who settled down in exile and acquired reputations were the philosophers Losky, Bulgakov, Berdyaev, Stepan Fusheslev, Karsavin, Frank, Iine, the historians Melganov, Myakutin, Kizaveder, Lapshin, and others, the writers and publicists Eichenwald, Izgoyev, and Osorgin Peshkanov. At the beginning of 1923, a small group were sent off, including, for example, V.F. Bulgakov, the secretary of Lev Tolstoy, and because of questionable associations, some mathematicians also shared this fate, including D.F. Selivanov. However, it didn't come out constantly and systematically. Perhaps it didn't work out. Perhaps the roar with which the emigres announced that they regarded it as a gift made it apparent that the punishment left something to be desired, that it was a mistake to have let go of good material for the executioner, and that poisonous flowers might grow in that garbage dump. And so they abandoned this form of punishment. and all subsequent purging led to either the executioner or the archipelago. The improved criminal code promulgated in 1926, which in effect continued right into Khrushchev's times, tied all the formerly scattered political articles into one durable dragnet, Article 58. And the roundup was underway. The catch swiftly expanded to include the engineering and technical intelligentsia. It was especially dangerous because it occupied a firm position in the economy, and it was hard to keep an eye on it with the help of the progressive doctrine alone. It now became clear that the trial in defense of Oldenburger had been a mistake. After all, a very nice little center had been organized there, and Krylenko's declaration that there was no question of sabotage on the part of the engineers in 1920 and 21 had granted an all too hasty absolution. Now it was not sabotage but worse, wrecking, a word discovered, it appears, by a rank-and-file interrogator in the Ch.10 case. It had no sooner been established the wrecking was what had to be tracked down, notwithstanding the non-existence of the concept in the entire history of mankind, that they began to discover it without any trouble in all branches of industry and in all individual enterprises. However, there was no unity of plan, no perfection of execution in all these hit-or-miss discoveries, although Stalin, by virtue of his character, and of course the entire investigative branch of our judicial apparatus, evidently aspired to just that. But our law had finally matured and could allow the world something really perfect, a big, coordinated, well-organized trial, this time a trial of engineers. And that is how the Ch.10 case came about. Letter K, the Ch.10 case, May 18th to July 15th, 1928. This case was tried before a special assize of the Supreme Court of the USSR under presiding Judge A.Y. Vyshinsky, who was still the rector of First Moscow University. Chief accuser was N.V. Krylenko. What a significant encounter, rather like handing over of the judicial relay baton. There were 53 defendants and 56 witnesses. How spectacular! Alas, in its spectacular aspect lay the weakness of this case. If one were to tie to each of the defendants only 3 threads of evidence, there would still have to be 159 of them. And meanwhile, Krylenko had only 10 fingers, and Vyshinsky another 10. Of course, the defendants strove to expose their heinous crimes. Excuse me. They strove to expose their heinous crimes to society, but not all of them did. Only 16. 13 wiggled back and forth, and 24 didn't admit their guilt at all. This introduced an impermissible discord, and the masses would certainly not understand it, although with its positive aspects, which had incidentally already been displayed in earlier trials, such as the helplessness of the defendants and the defense attorneys, and their inability either to budge or to deflect the implacable boulder of the sentence. The shortcomings of the new trial were fully apparent. Someone less experienced than Krylenko must have forgiven them, but not he. Krylenko must have been forgiven them, but not he. On the threshold of the classless society, we were at last capable of realizing the conflictless trial, a reflection of the absence of inner conflict in our social structure, in which not only the judge and the prosecutor, but also the defense lawyers and the defendants themselves would strive collectively to achieve their common purpose. Anyway, the whole scale of the Ch.10 case, comprising as it did the coal industry alone and the Donetsk basin alone, was disproportionately paltry for this era. It appears that then and there, on the day of the Ch.10 case ended, Krylenko began to dig a new capacious pit. Even two of his own colleagues in the Ch.10 case, the public accusers Oscillates and Iine, fell into it. And it goes without saying that the entire apparatus of the OGPU, which had already landed in Yagoda's firm hands, aided him willingly and adroitly. It was necessary to create and uncover an engineers' organization which encompassed the entire country. And for this purpose, it was essential to have a sphere, several long, prominent records at its head. And what engineer was unaware of such an unequivocally strong and impatiently proud leader, Pyotr Akimovich Palchinsky, an important mining engineer from as far back as the beginning of the century. He had been the deputy chairman of the War Industry Committee during Vol.1. In other words, he had directed the war efforts of all Russian industry, which had managed, during the course of the war, to make up for the failures of Tsarist preparations. After February 1917, he became the Deputy Minister of Trade and Industry. He had been persecuted under the Tsar for revolutionary activity. He had been imprisoned 3 times after October in 1917, 18, and 1922. From 1920 on, he had been a professor at the Mining Institute and a consultant of the glass plant, the supply beer plant, the State Planning Commission. They picked this Palchinsky to be the chief defendant in the grandiose new trial. However, the thoughtless Krylenko, stepping into what was for him a new field, engineering, not only knew nothing about the resistance of materials, but could not even conceive of the potential resistance of souls. Despite 10 years of already sensational activity as a prosecutor, Krylenko's choice turned out to be a mistake. Palchinsky resisted every pressure the OGPU knew. And did not surrender. In fact, he died without signing any sort of nonsense at all. N.K. von Meck and A.F. Vilchenko were subjected to torture with him, and they too appeared not to have given in. We do not yet know whether they died while under torture or whether they were shot, but they proved it was possible to resist, and that it was possible not to give in. And thus they left behind a spotlight of reproach to shine on all the famous subsequent defendants. To cover up his defeat, on May 24, 1929, Yagoda published a brief GPU communique on the execution of 3 for large-scale wrecking, which also announced the condemnation of many other unidentified persons. But how much time had been spent for nothing? Nearly a whole year. And how many nights of interrogation? and how much inventiveness on the part of the interrogators, and all to no avail, and Krylenko had to start over from the very beginning and find a leader who was both brilliant and strong, and at the same time utterly weak and totally pliable. But so did he understand this cursed breed of engineers that another whole year was spent in unsuccessful try. From the summer of 1929 on, he worked over Khrennikov, but Khrennikov too died without agreeing to play a dastardly role. They twisted old Fedotov, but he was too old, and furthermore he was a textile engineer, which was an unprofitable field. And one more year was wasted. The country was waiting for the all-inclusive records trial, and Comrade Stalin was waiting. But things just couldn't seem to fall into place for Krylenko. It was only in the summer of 1930 that someone found or suggested Ramzin, the director of the Thermal Engineering Institute. He was arrested, and in 3 months a magnificent drama was prepared and performed, a genuine perfection of our justice and unattainable model for world justice. Letter I. Prom Party, Industrial Party Trial, November 25th to December 7th, 1930. His case was tried at Special Assize of the Supreme Court with the same Vyshinsky, same Antonov, Saratowsky, and that same favorite of ours, Krylenko. This time none of those technical reasons arose to prevent leaders from being offered a full stenographic report from the trial, or to prohibit the attendance of foreign correspondents. There was a majesty of concept. All the nation's industry and its branches and planning organs sat at the defendants' benches. However, only the eyes of the man who arranged it all could see the crevices into which the mining industry and railroad transportation had disappeared. At the same time, there was a thrift in the use of material. There was only 8 defendants in all. The mistakes of the Ch.10 trial had been taken into account. You are going to exclaim, can 8 men represent the entire industry of the country? Yes, indeed. We have more even than we need. 3 out of 8 are solely in textiles, representing the industrial branch most important for national defense. But there were no doubt crowds of witnesses, just 7 in all, who were exactly the same sort of records as the defendants and were also prisoners. But there were no doubt bales of documents that exposed them, drawings, projects, directives, summaries of results, proposals, dispatches, private correspondence. No, not one. You mean to say not even one tiny piece of paper? How could the GPU let that sort of thing get by? They had arrested all those people, and they hadn't even grabbed one little piece of paper. There had to been a lot, but it had all been destroyed because there was no place to keep the files. At the trial, they produced only a few newspaper articles published in the émigré press on our own. But in that event, how could the prosecution present this case? Well, to be sure, there was Nikolai Vasilievich Krylenko, and to be sure, it wasn't the first time either. The best evidence, no matter what the circumstances, is the confessions of the defendant. But what confessions? These confessions were not forced, but inspired. repentance tearing the whole monologues from the beast and talk, to more talk and self-exposure and self-flagellation. They told old man Fedotov, who was 66, that he could sit down, that he had talked long enough, but no, he kept pouring out additional explanations and interpretations. For 5 sessions in a row, no questions were asked. The defendants kept talking, and explaining, and kept asking for the floor again and again. In order to supply whatever they had left out, they presented inferentially everything the prosecution needed without any questions whatever being asked. Ramthin, after extensive explanations, went on to provide brief resumes for the sake of clarity, as if he were addressing slow-witted students. The defendant were afraid, most of all, that something might be explained, that something might be left unexplained, that someone might go unexposed, that someone's name might go unmentioned, that someone's intention to wreck might not have been made clear, and how they reviled themselves. I am a class enemy. I was bragged. Our bourgeois ideology. And then the prosecutor, was that your error? And Tarnowski replied, and crying. There was simply nothing for Krylenko to do. For 5 sessions he went on drinking tea and eating cookies and whatever else they brought him. But how did the defendants sustain such an emotional explosion? There was no tape recorder to take down their words, but Otep, the defense attorney, described them, quote, the defendant's words flowed in a business-like manner, cold and professionally calm, unquote. There you are. Such a passion for confession, and business-like at the same time. Cold? More than that. They appear to have mumbled their glib repentance so listlessly that Vichinsky often asked them to speak louder, more clearly, because they couldn't be heard. The harmony of the trial was not at all diluted, disturbed by the defense, which agreed with all the prosecutor's proposals. The principal defense lawyer called the prosecutor's summation historic and described his own as narrow, admitting that in making it, he had gone against the dictates of his heart, for a Soviet defense lawyer is first of all a Soviet citizen, and, like all workers, he too is outraged at the crimes of the defendants. During the trial, the defense asked why and tentative questions, and then instantly backed away from them if Wyszynski interrupted. The lawyers actually defended only 2 harmless textile officials and did not challenge the formal charges, nor did the description of the defendants' actions, but asked only whether the defendants might avoid execution. It is more useful, comrade judges, to have their corpses or their labor. How foul-smelling were the crimes of these bourgeois engineers. Here is what they consisted of. They planned to reduce the tempo of development, as, for instance, to an overall annual increase in production of only 20 to 22%, whereas workers were prepared to increase it by 40 to 50%. They slowed down the rate of mining local fuels. They were too slow in developing Kuznetsk Basin. They exploited theoretical and economic arguments, such as whether to supply the Donetsk Basin with electricity from the Dnipro power station, or whether to build a super trunk line between Moscow and Donbass in order to delay the solutions of important problems. The work stops while engineers argue. They postponed considering new engineering projects. They did not authorize them immediately. In lectures on the resistance of materials, they took an anti-Soviet line. They installed worn-out equipment. They tied up capital funds, for example, by using them for costly and lengthy construction projects. They carried out necessary repairs. They misused metals. Some grades of iron were wanting. They created an imbalance between the departments of a plant and between the supply of raw materials and the capacity of processing them industrially. This was particularly notable in the textile industry, where they built one or two factories more than they needed to process the cotton harvest. Then they leapt from minimal to maximal plans, and obvious wrecking began through the accelerated development of that same unfortunate textile industry. Most importantly, they planned sabotage in the field of electric power, and though none was ever carried out, the wrecking did not take the form of actual damage done, but remained within the area of operational planning. Yet it was intended to lead a nationwide crisis and even to economic paralysis in 1930. But it didn't, and only because of the competitive industrial and financial plans of the masses, doubling the figures. Yeah, begins the skeptical reader. What, that isn't enough for you? But if, at the trial, we repeat every point and chew on it over 5 or 8 times, then perhaps it turns out to not be so negligible. Yeah, the reader of the 60s nonetheless sticks in his own view. Mightn't all that have happened precisely because of those competing industrial and financial plans? Aren't things bound to be out of balance if any union meeting, without consulting God's plan, can twist the ratio around as it pleases? On the prosecutor's bread is bitter. And after all, they decided to publish every last word. That meant the engineers would read it too. You've made your bed, now lie in it. And Krylenko rushed in fearlessly to discuss and to question the cross-question engineering details. And the inside pages of the inserts of the enormous newspapers were full of small print and about fine technical points. Notion was that either reader would be overcome by the sheer mass of volume, that he wouldn't have enough time, even that he used up all his evenings and his rest days too, and so he wouldn't read it at all, but would only notice the refrain following every few paragraphs. They were records. But suppose someone did begin and read every last line. In that case, he would come to see through the banality of self-accusations composed with such ineptitude and stupidity that the Lubyanka boa constrictor had gotten involved in something outside its competence, its own kind of work, that what breaks free of the crude noose is a strong-winged thought of the 20th century. There the prisoners are, even in the dock, submissive, repressed, but their thoughts leap out. Even their terrified, tired tongues manage to name everything with its proper name, and to tell us everything. Here's the situation in which they worked. Kalinikov. Well, to be sure, a situation of technical distress was created. Larachev, whether we wanted to or not, we still had to produce for that 42 millions of tons of petroleum, i.e., it had been thus ordered from on high, because no matter what, 42 million tons of petroleum could not have been produced under any circumstances whatever. Oh, I gotta take a break. I'm so sorry. I can't talk. Have a good night.